it's not unlike what's happening on the soccer field, right? Where it's like, hey, we don't know how to handle conflict anymore, and so we're just not going to do it. I'm going to give you that red card the second you do, and then we're never going to learn to have the healthy conversation. And so I do think we need to get away from, and if it means starting small, if it means like, hey, we're gonna get together and we're gonna argue about our favorite movie, and talk about that, just so we can get comfortable having like healthy conflict and recognize, and like talking about those things. I think we've just got to normalize some of that practice so that we can get back to learning to have those uncomfortable conversations. I just think we've kind of lost that skill, and then the more we've lost that skill, the more we've tried, like we've avoided it and avoided opportunities to develop it.
So an interesting piece there when I think about that concept, at least through my lens, through my individual lens, I've always been very comfortable in conversation about disagreements, like I not that I would lean into it or look for it to happen, but I often thought about the positivity that comes from it, right? Like if you have healthy discourse and healthy disagreement, oftentimes you leave the scenario in a better place than stewing over it in the beginning anyway. Yeah. So I've always kind of had that awareness and been comfortable addressing situations. One change though, one shift throughout my life, and I wonder if this is at a societal level, because disagreement has become so polarizing now, that I wonder, for me, I find myself almost addressing those things less now because of the potential ramifications in my life.
Right.
Like I feel a lot more weight right now. I have a 4-year-old son. I feel a lot more weight as a human than I ever have in my life. A lot more responsibility.
Right.
Because there's another human that counts everything on me.
Right.
And that means a lot of things. That means not just your job, like people talk about the job all the time, but just like life in general, community perception, what relationships do in life for you. Relationships open so many doors. And I'm wondering if those two things are tied together, like that the so polarized environment that leads to like, okay, I can't talk about this because if I'm a business owner, half my business is gone. Or if I'm, if I'm a referee, I have friends in the stands on both teams and I'm going to lose some. And you get what I'm getting at? I don't really have a great question formed of it, but I wonder if that's an expansive piece of this.
So there's this research study that, and I'm not going to be able to remember the authors or the year, but a research study came out a few years ago that I found really, really fascinating, looking at gratitude. And it's connected to what you're saying here, because so we know, like, for the last decade, we've been talking about gratitude and how valuable it is, and it's the secret to happiness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And all that's true. Like, that research is great. And if you want to, be a happier person, one of the things you should do is be grateful for the things you have. There is a consequence to gratitude, though. And what this study found is that people who are thankful for what they have in their lives are much less likely to take bold stands for exactly the reason you're describing. And that when you acknowledge all of the things that you have to be thankful for, you become more scared of losing those things. And the consequence of that is you don't push boundaries. You don't take bold stands. You don't get in arguments with people. You're actually, I think the study specifically looked at, the degree to which people sort of push social justice initiatives. You don't push social justice initiatives. Like, you're too concerned about losing the things you have to take some of those bold positions. And so there's a danger or a potential danger in that, or a potential downside associated with that. Now, you weren't talking about gratitude necessarily specifically, but I think it connects in some ways to what you're saying. Like, you feel this pressure because you've got things and people in your life who care about you and are depending on you, that it becomes harder to do some of the thing, to like have those tough conversations because you don't want to lose some of those things.
That's fascinating to think about, man.
Yeah.
Fascinating to think about, because if I put that on the timeline of what I'm talking about, I've always been by nature pretty like filled with gratitude. Like I love life.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate in a lot
too.
of different ways.
Yeah.
But you know, when I was more apt to make a stand and take that, I had far less physical things, and like my gratitude stemmed from existing and having a voice and having an opinion. So of course that's more like, I've never thought about that like that. That's fascinating, man.
And you know what's funny? So I can even sort of map this out on my trajectory as like sort of a social media scholar, you know, like a public scholar. So I've put a lot of weight in the last 5 years on trying to communicate with the public like we're doing now, right? And I think early on when I had very few followers, I was more willing to be bold. I was more willing to sort of get into arguments with people and things like that. And then as I started developing more followers, I think I started paying attention to them and started listening to them, I started to get a little too worried how they might react if I said something unpopular. And so I started to, I think honestly, like if I'm thinking back on it, I think I became a little less bold in some of the positions I was taking. And the funny downside of that is I actually think that alienated followers more than anything, like that they sort of felt like, oh, he's kind of being a wuss now, you know? Like, you know,
and
so,
sometimes things can come off as inauthentic too,
yes,
and that's a
exactly.
big deal.
Yeah. And so I think, you know, one of the things that I've really tried to prioritize lately is worry less about that. Worry about the message that you're trying to put out there. Pay attention to that. Think about that and try and communicate what you want people to hear. And don't worry too much about how they respond to it. You know, and then, I mean, you know, and then start that conversation with them. And if they push back and disagree, have a conversation with them about why they disagree instead of starting from the position of they're going to disagree. And, you know, the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking about before we got on the gratitude thing is that, so in group therapy, we talk about like 3 stages of the therapeutic process. And in the beginning, the group is like typically pretty like affable and they get along, right? And they're like, hey, everybody's sort of being polite. And then for a lot of groups, the second stage is like some sort of conflict stage where people start to disagree with one another and they start to push back and they start to argue. And that part of the group therapy process is like fundamental. It's where the trust is built that allows people to move on. And I would argue this is true of all healthy relationships. Navigating conflict is one of the ways you develop like trust and intimacy.
Yep.
Disagreeing with people and then learning, and this is the part that I think in modern society we're maybe missing, is learning, hey, we can disagree and then we can still care about each other and still want to, and there's times where this isn't going to work, of course, but like we can disagree and we can argue and then we can come out of it on the other side with a better understanding of one another and like genuine trust in one another and frankly a deeper emotional relationship or deeper emotional connection because we navigated that conflict. And I think it's when people don't navigate that conflict that they come out sort of more polarized. And that seems to be what's happening so often, is that people are coming out of conflict without ever, they're not learning to like kind of navigate that conflict in a healthy way.
Well, that's probably driven by social media because it's really easy to get to the point where, okay, I'm just not going to comment back anymore.
Yep.